Good morning, one and all. I hope you are rested and refreshed. And let's commence our conference work of the day. So I think I saw most of you last night, but if not, I'm Joel Carpenter. I work here at Calvin College. I'm the director of the Nagel Institute for the Study of World Christianity. It's been my privilege to serve on IAPCHE's board, and I was part of the planning team for this meeting. And Harry Fernhout was saying, you know, if we're going to do this theme, how can we help but really feature interfaith dialogue? And so how do we do that? And we've been talking about having some plenary panels, and you know, then it hit me. You know, I had just earlier in the year been visiting with Kurt Berends and with members of the Idea Fund in Kurt's offices, or no, actually somebody else's offices in downtown Grand Rapids. And I thought, this is absolutely perfect. Kurt and his colleagues have hit on a really wonderful approach, and I think it would be great if they could share it with us. And fortunately, Kurt and his colleagues agreed, and so they are here today. I'll let Kurt introduce his colleagues on the panel, but I want to say just a word of introduction with Dr. Kurt Berends. Kurt is the head of the Issachar Fund here in town, which is an operating foundation that is involved in generating not only good ideas, but programs and agencies to give those ideas legs. And I think the Idea Fund is one of those for sure. But Kurt, by way of introduction, is really no stranger to Christian higher education. He began his formal career therein at the University of Notre Dame, where he was an assistant to the provost, working on special projects, and the major one for many years was the Pew Scholars Program, which was investing in research and writing of eminent Christian scholars across North America. And so Kurt got a very full Rolodex, as the old saying used to be. What would we say today? Database. So he's gotten to know and appreciate and advance the work of many who, in the terms of the Jesuits, I would say are involved in the intellectual apostolate. So Kurt he's a native of Grand Rapids, and he came back here to work on another great idea that he had heard about and had helped to keep generating and building and developing, and that was a way to support the work of Christian theological schools worldwide, specifically with library development. So he was the founder here in Grand Rapids about a dozen years ago now, maybe longer, of the Theological Book Network, and which just this past year celebrated its 2 millionth book being placed in majority world theological libraries. So an amazing project and an enduring organization now doing great good work, and Kurt was its founder and director. And from there to the Issachar Fund, which is involved in, as I said, many great and good works, but we'll focus on the Idea Fund. Idea stands for the Interfaith Development and Entrepreneurial Activities Fund, based once again on one very good idea, and that is that there are growing numbers of programs of interfaith dialogue around the world, and of course here in the U.S. and Canada. But many of them are the efforts of thought leaders of faith traditions and folks who work very hard at dialogue, come to certain common understandings, but then what? And you know, I think the Idea Fund has really pushed hard on the then what side of things. So they say we want to advance interfaith dialogue, but we also want to see ways in which it can generate and advance friendship partnership, trust, community building, and positive community-based action among people of faith. So it goes beyond interfaith dialogue into interfaith collaboration. And Kurt and his panel here are here today to help us understand how this has been working in some important sites around the country already. So Kurt, thank you very much.
Thanks, Joel, for that good introduction. Learning to listen, listening to learn. When I saw that title, I thought, that is great. That's exactly what you get with educators, and it's important. Ideas matter. But we changed the title a little bit for our session from a dialogue of words to a dialogue of action. And there's two thoughts behind that. I want to read a quote from Bishop Kenneth Craig, who has done quite a bit of work and engagement in the Muslim world. He wrote, "Biography has always been the first clue to theology. And in Christian tradition, the reality of God is believed to have been biographized," there's a nice word for you, "in Jesus Christ as the Lord." Thinking of that made me think more of the work of Andrew Walls, a historian, and how Andrew writes so often of the challenge of translation, the give and take. And as we were working first at the Issachar Fund for an event that was going to be our first bringing together of Christians and Muslims to talk about creation, it dawned on me, we can talk, and it needs to happen. Dialogue is important. You need to define words, get together, get clarity on distinction and what you mean. But there comes a point in time where you need to see those words in action, how they're lived out. So we can talk about what we mean by forgiveness as Christians. Our fellow Muslims can do that. We can talk our understanding of mercy, how we view God. That's great. At some point, though, the context in which those words play out matters. This actually jumped out to me at a conference or a gathering Joel and I were at in Ghana with a fellow foundation a few years back that is gifted in its staff leadership with a bunch of analytic philosophers. And analytic philosophers are great at narrowing down the meaning of the words. Boom. Let's get to as concise and tight, agreed upon definition as we can. But what was interesting is watching our African colleagues push back. What about context? What about context? Context matters. Well, context comes when you're interacting with one another and watching people as they live these things out. So that's a little bit what animates the Idea Fund. We think our conversations are important. We will have them. But we think learning to work side by side is important as well. I'm going to very briefly introduce the panelists and not do near the justice to them or pay them the tributes they deserve that Joel paid me. Part of the reason for that is when they talk, I expect some of their remarks will be autobiographical. After I introduce them, we're going to watch two very short video clips, one that introduces the Idea Fund, and then the second, which introduces a gathering we had, which we called it an IGC, an Idea Generator Conference, which is really the first space of trying to bring young people, primarily, together to come up with ideas that can be implemented in community. And then after that, we will go and I will ask the panelists to reflect on these three questions. And I'm going to do this right up front. They have them written down, but I'm happy to repeat them too. I want them to think about or reflect with you what first opened their eyes to engaging the other. What makes us see that we might engage someone different from ourselves? Sometimes these instances are forced on us, but often there are other events that draw us into being willing to walk alongside the other. I want them to reflect on what was their biggest fear, or remains their biggest fear. You can't escape the fear component in this world today when you talk about interfaith engagement. I was just telling, you've been watching the news, you saw what happened in London. It was about a year and a half ago. Saeed and I and a group of us were sitting in Chicago, small group, I think 12 or 14, half Christian, half Muslim, when the San Bernardino shootings happened. It helped me rethink the question of who's afraid. We tend to, as Christians in North America at least, our fear is shaped by this vision of terrorism and what might happen. It was interesting to see real deep and abiding concern with my Muslim friends there of what was happening because of that event to their families and their mosques and their communities. And I thought the fear cuts both ways, and it cuts deep. We can't hide it, we can't act like it doesn't exist, but we need to be able to talk about it and listen to one another. And then I'm going to ask them just to reflect briefly on a lesson or two maybe they've learned in their journey thus far. And we'll start with Janey Berends, a student at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee, my niece. I am her proud uncle. She has been a wonderful niece to have. After that, we will go to our second student, Ozair Shareef, who participated in our event at Chicago. Muhammad is a student, one more year to go at Wayne State, and then graduate school, I believe, right? Is that right? So he's going to live in this world of ideas. Then co-conspirator, co-founder of the Idea Fund, Saeed Khan, professor at Wayne State. And if we tried reading Saeed's bibliography or CV of things he has done, what he has his fingers in, we would be here all 90 minutes. So, and then Professor John Barton at Pepperdine. And those two are going to go last, and they may end up talking over each other, you will find. I know John through Saeed. They co-taught a class together for a number of years at Rochester Bible College down by Detroit before John moved on to, I don't know if they're greener pastures on the West Coast. It doesn't seem very green in California.
Greener, no, yeah.
But different pastures.
Different pastures. Yeah.
So, but by way of introduction, I want you to take a quick look at a video. I think it's about 5 minutes long on the Idea Fund, and then we'll do a very quick video of gives an overview of what we did in Chicago.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah.
Whitechapel, London, to our left, St. Paul's Cathedral, to our right, the largest mosque in the UK, a fusion of cultures. I feel a real sense of urgency when it comes to the issue of pushing interfaith collaboration. If you look at the world around us, things seem to be getting worse and not better. If you look at places like Iraq, which has literally been emptied of its ancient Christian population, you look at places like Pakistan, where just a few days ago, in fact, there was a huge bomb blast targeting innocent Christians in Lahore as they were celebrating Easter Sunday. And then you look at the West, where every day there's rising anti-Muslim bigotry, both in the United States and in Europe. Every day we're hearing of incidents of innocent Muslims being targeted simply for being Muslims. So misunderstanding seems to be increasing, and that seems to be leading to more bigotry and more cases of violence, and we have to act now to put a stop to such bigotry. In today's fast-paced, interconnected, globalized world, the importance of human interconnectivity is even more important. It's important for people to meet one another, greet one another, and work together collectively in a manner that can have an impact on the broader world. And I think Christians and Muslims are very uniquely placed to do such a thing. We both agree on the vision that Jesus had. And I think that vision is something that can help unite us and help us fight against injustice wherever we might see it in the world. So frankly, one of the big constraints that we've had around interfaith work is that there hasn't been enough of it. I think we have a lot of interfaith work in certain pockets and segments of society across the United States and Europe, but frankly, there's a whole wide world out there where interfaith has yet to make an impact.
The Idea Fund began with a question. Can we experience a good in common that we cannot experience alone? We believe yes. Our goal is to shape a new kind of conversation, a conversation built on trust and friendship, that enables new learning and promotes the development of community-based endeavors that benefit not just communities of faith, but all of society.
What excites me about the Idea Fund is how we're putting innovation and collaboration at the heart of our solution. Whether the issue is climate change, poverty, entrepreneurship, the Idea Fund ensures that positive interfaith collaboration is at the heart of our solution for some of these pressing global problems.
The great potential of the fund is that it's both a facilitator and an incubator. We're facilitating people coming together for ideas and projects. We're going to incubate those ideas and projects. But perhaps even more valuable is that the fund is going to be a facilitator and an incubator for relationships going forward, and then creating tangible engagement for several generations.
Every day, millions of people are inspired by their faith to make the world a better place. And that is a huge positive energy for this world. Whether we're talking about issues from poverty to climate change, to the war on terror, to instability in the Middle East, people motivated by faith are trying to fix all these problems. But the problem is that often they're working within their respective faith traditions. There's nothing wrong with that. But collaboration with other faith traditions can be a massive force multiplier. And that's the kind of world I want to help create.
The edge effect is an ecological concept that describes a space where the edge of two realms overlap, such as land and water, or forest and grassland. These areas are viewed as a fragile ecosystem, but only because this is where diversity and life happens. The Idea Generator Conference has created an edge effect for two faiths to meet through an intentional space, for us to create a generative habitat for sacred meaning and belonging.
I'm Sidra Ali. I'm from Detroit, Michigan. I'm a student at Harvard University, getting a master's degree in Islamic Studies and a concentration in law. I was invited to the Idea Generator Conference by Saeed, a former professor and a current colleague of mine. I look forward to attending the conference, as I've always been interested in creating spaces for marginalized populations, but moreover, creating spaces where the environment and interfaith dialogue can always be a priority.
Having not spent too much time interacting with Muslims previously, some of my preconceived notions going into this experience about where we're coming from in our beliefs and similarities, those have been deconstructed a bit, which presents certain challenges in working together, but also exciting possibilities.
So this is the first time our team has gotten together formally to finally ideate and kind of get together and brainstorm what we're going to do for the project proposal.
Teamwork is hard. It's especially hard when you're working across differences of culture, class, religion, backgrounds, experiences, and it's been a very fascinating experience trying to get to a place where we're all on the same page. And what's been really empowering and exciting is that we're working on something that is around our shared inheritance, creation, and the stewardship of creation.
As a Muslim coming to this weekend, working with Christians on a team to develop an environmental project, I was anticipating some challenges, maybe thinking that we might be paired up with evangelical Christians who want to focus on converting Muslims in this weekend's discussion. But I haven't found that to be the case. In fact, what I found is that we have a common foundation and basis in our respective faiths on care for the environment.
So Right now, we just finished brainstorming and working as a team to get all of our thoughts together and reducing them to something concrete that we can work with to further pitch our idea proposal. About to break for lunch.
Yeah, it was like nowhere near the Zara and the Apple Store type of right. Our faith tradition inspires me to do this because of X, Y, and Z. And then that's that interfaith education component as well, where you're really kind of digging deep and saying, I'm not doing this just to put on my resume or like to say that I'm a good person, but I'm really called or moved to do this.
It is important that people of faith are not co-opted into environmental action by pasting some extra faith component onto an environmentalist activity, but instead that they really look into their faith traditions and realize that founded in their own faith traditions is of deep motivation for a different way of interacting with the environment.
It's been an incredible day so far. Between the amazing breakfast and lunch and between the workshops on sustainability and timelines and accountability and I guess business aspects of approaching a project of this level, we were able to work with our teams today and kind of boil down what these huge macro level ideas are to something very tangible and something that we can present to the judges. We actually had a pitch today where the teams went in and gave the judges our best foot forward and came back with some really helpful criticism and feedback and ways to improve. And so with all the challenges we had, we also had 1,000,005 opportunities.
I'm an introvert, so I process and think ideas really well alone. But I realized, especially through this kind of experience, that my ideas really take shape in life when working with others.
So our team just got pulled first to go ahead and present. I guess this is where it all comes down and boils down to, and I think we'll make it. I think we'll do great.
Initially, I was hopeful of winning the grant money for an idea, but I've come to realize that the networking is much more important.
We pitched a creative, interactive playscape that would allow Muslims and Christians come together and form communities that practice intentional faith, place, and community.
We're also going to generate electricity with the playscape, which we thought was important. Also teach people how difficult it is to generate electricity. And that would go into producing a sustainable garden that would literally produce energy and literally feed the students in off-campus communities. Minds and body.
And this garden actually would create a sense of beauty and wholeness.
After presenting, I believe as a team, we did incredible. As an individual, if I can look back and see what I did right and what I did wrong, I think there's some points I would change. But I think overall, we did okay. We did awesome. We got our project out there. We got our message out there. And I think up to now, we've been able to mobilize as a team, and hopefully our new idea and message can mobilize others. Team Pink did not win, but in an amazing, amazing way, maybe a plot twist, just saying, Team Blue and Team Yellow did come out with first and second place prizes respectively, and that is probably the most incredible thing. Not because of just one individual's ideas, but because every single idea presented today, and I guess every single idea that was cultivated throughout these past 3 days has been incredible on so many aspects. And I feel extraordinarily privileged to be not only witness to all of these ideas, but also to be a part of the process in which created these ideas. So, Team Blue and Yellow, congratulations. Team Pink, I'll see you on the flip side. We still got it.
So that was an event that flowed out of an earlier conversation we'd had in Turkey. Just a little update, we can talk more about this later if you want. The winning project and actually two projects were combined and will be implemented starting this year down at Duke University, which will be a year-long project of Christian and Muslim students meeting weekly together, weekly or bi-weekly, with readings, learning, conversation, but then also going into the community and engaging in a set of challenges, environmental projects that they've designed that impact the Durham community. It will be done in competitive format, and at the end, the team with the most points ends up spending 2 weeks in Morocco on an organic farm, working alongside people of other faiths. So, this was an experiment for us. The experiment is still underway. But one thing we did learn was the importance of learning to walk alongside one another. Learning to try to come together, to listen, to hear, and to find ways we can work together. The theme, as you picked up from the second video, was creation. We had a gathering earlier called Creation, Our Shared Inheritance. Both Christian, Muslim, Jews, other faiths too, believe we live in a world created by God. That gives us a starting point for interacting, and that's what we wanted to unpack, how we see this world, where we can work together on behalf of it. And there are lots of other ways to approach it, but that was behind it. But now I'm going to turn this over. I am going to let Janey go first. You remember the questions, or you have your talking points, all right?
Okay. So I'm just doing question 1 to start, right?
All three, you can just talk
Okay.
the whole process.
All right. Hello, everybody. In answer to the question of when I first became interested or involved with engaging the other or interfaith dialogue, interfaith dialogue specifically was something that was new to me when I stepped into this idea generator conference, but intercultural dialogue was something I'd been interested in for a few years, really since I started college, and a little bit of background of the reason for that. I grew up in Hudsonville, Michigan, which is pretty homogenous culturally, ethnically, and religiously too. It's pretty white Christian, a lot of Dutch and German. So when I went to Union University, which is in Jackson, Tennessee, I mean, that's still not the most diverse of places, but what I noticed living in the southern United States was that racial tensions were a lot more pronounced than I knew they could still be in the United States. I kind of had thought that was something more in the past, and then I noticed that it wasn't, and the bitterness that was still there from both sides was palpable. So that jarred me, and that made me really want to, I guess that's how I came to be involved in Union's multicultural group called Mosaic, which was a Christian group, but really focused on getting to know people who are outside of just your own little ethnic bubble. So all that to say, it's been a couple of years that I've been interested in intercultural interaction, and so when Dr. Berends, my uncle, asked me if I would be interested in this interfaith conference, I said, let me think for a second. Okay, yes, because it just seemed like a good next step of trying to understand other ways of thinking, other ways of living, other than my own. And that really is a way to get past like the tensions that I was seeing between different groups. Anyway, so that's how I got involved in the Idea Generator Conference. My initial concerns or fears with interfaith dialogue with this conference, the first thing that comes to mind is how am I going to explain the purpose of this conference to some of my Christian family members and friends. I was afraid that certain people were going to see this as saying that Christianity and Islam are basically the same and our differences don't matter, compromising the truth or something like that. And as I was thinking through how to explain the purpose of the conference to other people, I realized I was trying to explain it to myself too. Like I was asking myself, is that what we're saying? Are we saying our differences don't matter here? And I know that that's not the case. You know, everybody who came to this conference came because we're devout Christians or devout Muslims and we really care about what our doctrines say. We just want to work together with that. But it can be a little bit scary because on the surface, to other people, they might not understand that that's what you're doing. And then as far as what I've learned or what I came away from the conference with, and this is something that's true not just in interfaith dialogue, but also intercultural dialogue, is that it's easier to make assumptions about people who aren't there. So if you, like, I didn't know any Muslims really personally before I came to this conference, and it just is better to know an individual, I don't really have another way to word that. It's just easier to make assumptions and have this picture in your head of what a Muslim is like, or what a black American is like, or what a white American is like. But if you never interact with those people, then the picture you have in your head isn't going to be very accurate. And not that you can know one person and then say, okay, now I know what all Muslims are like, but it's just much better to interact with a person than to try to get to know them from a distance, you know? And then one other thing is that in intercultural or interfaith dialogue, you really get to know about yourself too. That's something I noticed in like my intercultural studies classes at Union. You know, we really talked almost as much about like our own, it wasn't so much learning about other cultures, but learning about your own cultural biases. And I think that's important in interfaith dialogue too. Like in order to talk with my Muslim friends about their faith, I need to really know my faith too and understand that better and understand the parts I don't understand as well. Yeah, so that's what I have to say.
Thanks, Janey. One note I didn't make, in the opening video, Madassar, who's also a board member, as well as Sarah Hohenstein, so our other co-founding board member of the Idea Fund, Madassar makes a point, there are 3 billion Christian and Muslims in this world who wake up every day wondering how their faith might make a difference. That was one of the things we really wanted when we put together the gathering in Chicago is we want people who think their faith matters. We recognize we don't see eye to eye on everything. In fact, there's a reason Christianity and Islam are the 2 largest faiths. They actually both believe in proselytization. It's probably a dirty word in much of society today. But we do think our faith matters, our witness matters. When we gathered together, we wanted people who acted out of a conviction that their faith mattered. But we also came together with the assumption that, while we both believe conversion is important, that's not why we're here. There are other things our faith also tells us are important. Care for creation is one, and that's what we're here to talk about. People will have conversations on the side, relationships happen, and in fact, I think in our first gathering in Istanbul, we had converts both ways represented there. But we were here to learn and to do, animated by shared convictions that we could identify on Care for Creation. So thanks, Janey. Mohammed, you're up.
All right, hello everyone. So I actually started doing some interfaith work before I started doing interfaith dialogue. A few years ago, a couple of friends of mine, we all started this nonprofit called Detroit is My Home to help out with the homeless in Detroit. We saw that there was a huge population of homeless people in Detroit, and there wasn't really a lot being done to help them out. And like one of the reasons for doing it was that we wanted to shed some like positive light on like Muslims in the U.S. because we find that a lot of the times our parents will, most of our immigrants will send a lot of money back home to improve infrastructure back there, but no one will like invest over here, our current home, and we saw that as being a problem. So we wanted to do something about it, and so we started off this organization, and we did a couple of collaborations with Detroit Rescue Mission Ministries, and one of which it was an event called Happy Feet, where we teamed up with this free clinic, and we kind of made sure that homeless people's feet were taken care of before the winter started. So we had the free clinic called Huda Clinic. There, they were providing podiatrists, and there were some students from a beauty salon providing free haircuts. And Detroit is My Home was there providing care packages to all the people that came to the event. And it was then where I started talking with one of the janitors there, and he kind of told me his story. He told me how when he was in Florida, he did some time, and then he came to Michigan, and now he had a job and everything, and he was talking about how everything that's happened in his life has happened for a reason. And I was like, we actually believe the same thing in Islam, like everything happens for the best. And that was kind of where it initially started with me. And one of the people who started the organization with me was one of Saeed's students, Sidra, as you guys saw in the video. And when she found out about the IGC conference, she told me to apply. And I applied, and that was when I initially started interfaith dialogue more formally. I think my biggest fear was that I would be an ambassador of my religion, because the thing is, I don't have the knowledge to do that. I think going into the conference, I had probably a Sunday school level education. I only went to an Islamic school probably first few years of school and before I started going to public school, but that was about it. I really did not know much about the religion, and I was afraid that when people would ask me questions, I wouldn't be able to answer them, and then people would kind of walk away like not having these answers, and it would just reflect poorly on me and possibly the religion itself. And that was probably what I was most afraid of. What was the last question?
Something you've learned, a lesson or two from your experiences.
So before going into this conference, I really didn't know what to expect. I'd never had any interfaith dialogue before, and I didn't know whether it was going to be, I didn't know what the nature of the conversation was going to be, whether we were going to try and prove, which religion is better or not, or which religion is superior, and I just never knew because I'd never had a conversation before about it. And when I started having these conversations with Janey, because she was in my group, and then some of my other group members, I realized it's about keeping an open mind and just listening to one another, and just kind of understanding where each person is coming from. And I think that was probably one of my biggest takeaways, that interfaith isn't about proving anything, it's about understanding what's already there. And since the conference, I actually tried to set up a collaboration with New Life Church on campus, where on Earth Day we would like plant trees, and then after that, we would have a discussion about what it meant to us. But unfortunately, we weren't able to do that, but I'm hoping in the coming year, now that I have a little more leverage, I might be able to do that. So, yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mohammed. We're going to skip over Saeed, and we'll go to John, Barton next, and then Saeed. Just be forewarned, since these two have co-taught, I wouldn't be surprised if they start co-speaking or speaking over one another. That's been known to happen.
It has, yeah. So
we do have.
Yeah. Well, good morning, everyone. Glad to be here, and glad to be here with all of you, and back in Michigan, where I lived for a number of years, and always glad. I was telling Kurt, anytime Saeed calls me and says, "Hey, do you want to do something?" I try to do it. I love being here with my friend Saeed as well. I believe, I really do believe that all this starts with biography, and just a very short version of this and the way it started for me. In the early 90s, my wife and I were part of a church planting mission team that moved to Uganda, East Africa, and spent a number of years over there, raised our children over there, and we're part of, evangelical evangelism and church planting and discipling ministries and all the rest. And it's an important part of my life, continues to be. And yet, as is often the case, and as many of you have had similar experiences, when I went in my mid-20s, I thought of evangelism and church planting. Although I wouldn't have used these words, it tended to take the shape of competition for the souls of the people of Uganda, and so Muslims and others ended up being the competitors. We lived in an area that was about 20% Muslim. There's also a strong Hindu population, as well, of course, indigenous religious perspectives and practices. But a number of things started to swirl and happen in our experiences there. For one thing, we started to experience some pretty severe Christian malfunctioning in East Africa at the time. We lived there at the time of the Rwandan genocide, and have a lot of experiences related to that, traveling into Rwanda and Rwandans pouring into the borders over to Uganda, and being a part of a story in the most Christianized country on the continent. About over 90% of the Rwandan population self-identified as Christian at the time of the genocide, and trying to wrap my 25-year-old mind around that and what that means, and a country that had been and had continued to be increasingly successful in terms of church planting, what I had gone to do, and yet something like this was happening. As well as in Uganda at the time, the Lord's Resistance Army was a very prominent presence. If you don't know about them, it's a group that has been active for 30 years, long, complicated history, but a group that claimed Christian identity, that decided that they were led by the Holy Spirit. They would put crosses on their chest, and they would abduct children and terrorize northern Uganda and other parts of East Africa, and trying to come to grips with what that meant. And then I came across the problem, a big problem, of Muslim piety. And I'm saying all this just saying it kind of turned the tables in a lot of my perspectives and a lot of my experiences, and came across friendships, deep friendships with members of the Muslim community in East Africa that formed bonds, and that we formed friendships and collaborations trying to address some of the malfunctions in the areas that we were. And those turned into some beautiful relationships where we did explore some profound and I would say even irreconcilable differences between our faith commitments and our faith convictions. And yet across those differences formed some deep friendships and started to collaborate around some shared and overlapping needs. And there's a lot more I could say about all of that, obviously. But coming back from Uganda, those experiences continued for me. I moved to the Detroit area, and some of those deep friendships and collaborations entered a new realm with people like Saeed, and our friendships and our overlaps and our co-teaching and our work in the Detroit area, and now what I'm doing in the LA area. with different interfaith initiatives. And last thing I'll say, and then Saeed can speak and we'll go back and forth a little bit here. But I really like, Kurt, this emphasis on then what. I desperately want to be a part of, I'm a person who lives my life committed to the Lordship of Jesus. And the ideas and the convictions and the theologies are so important for us to talk out and to understand each other. And I want to increase religious literacy. But that then what question continues to sit with me. And what does it mean for Muslims and Christians to live together in respect and in certain forms of solidarity with one another, and what that looks like? And so I've been privileged, some with Saeed in Detroit and now in LA, to be a part of organizations that try to bring Christians and Muslims together for iftar dinners or for Easter celebrations or for different service projects. And that's been a challenging and joyful thing in my life. And this gentleman right next to me has been a big part of that for me. That's an abrupt stop, but
That's actually like a glottal stop. All right, well, how do you follow that? Well, first of all, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I think I probably have the easiest task of answering question number one when it comes to what first opened my eyes to engaging with the other. And I'm a bit troubled with the word other because I don't really consider people to be other. But be that as it may, essentially when I opened my eyes, it was engaging with the other. I grew up for the first 8 years of my life in England, and for the rest of my life, and we don't have to do the math, here in the US. And so the notion of interfaith engagement occurred not only when I stepped outside the door of our home, but also what came to our home. I was always enriched by this fact that my parents had such a multicultural base of friends and relations. So everybody in South Asian culture is either an uncle or an aunt when they're older than you. So it was a Sikh uncle, it was a Hindu aunt, it was a Jewish uncle. All of them were part of my life and from whom I was so enriched. When I was in school as a wee lad in England, we had assembly every day, even in public school. And I used to be able to rock the Book of Common Prayer and the Book of Hymns more than at that point any Islamic scripture. And we used to sing hymns. And we always used to end with the same devotional, which also happened to be a #1 hit at the time. So this will probably help betray my age. And it was by, ironically, a very famous singer who then later converted to Islam, Cat Stevens. And the song was Morning Has Broken. So I'm like, wow, full circle. Later on, I realized and became disillusioned with the way that Islam, and I think religion as a whole, was being navigated. And it was almost this moment where Catcher in the Rye meets the Quran. The idea that what I saw was not so much the application of religion, but the statement of religion. That it was, I am a Muslim, but many people weren't really living that, and what I thought was the ethos of it. And then 9/11 happened. And there was this greater sense of urgency to do something. And then interfaith engagement and interfaith dialogue became these buzzwords that people were using. And one of my fears was, when it came to this engagement, is, am I equipped to do this? And I remember thinking, and my dad really reinforced this, he says, you've been doing this your whole life. Every time you have an interaction with somebody, our front yard used to be the football field for the neighborhood. And I can tell you, growing up in Lapeer, Michigan, I was a unicorn. There really weren't any other Muslims. And so that kind of organic engagement was something that was vital. And just one story about 9/11, which, again, coming back to Lapeer, at 11 o'clock at night, a car pulls up in my parents' driveway. My parents live in a fairly modest neighborhood, and Lapeer is quiet enough that you can hear a car coming from miles away. And it's a squad car. And my dad's a doctor there, still is, and knows all the policemen and everything, never gets a ticket, very annoying. And oftentimes the cops will park in my parents' driveway in order to pick off speeders in the subdivision, which of course I'm sure makes them really popular with teenagers. And so my dad opens up the door, sees a couple of police officers that he knows, walks up to the car and says, "Hey, you know, how's everything going tonight? Looking for speeders?" And they kind of look at him quizzically saying, "Well, kind of, Doc." And what they usually do is they spend about 15 minutes there and then they head off because now everybody knows that there's a car there. And so my dad says, "Oh, so you're going to be here for a little while and then be off?" And they said, "Well, no, actually, we're thinking about just kind of camping out here for the night." And my dad, of course, being my dad, says, "Oh, you've got a real rash of speeders tonight?" And they said, "Well, no, Doc, actually, given what happened this morning in New York and in Washington and in Pennsylvania," they said, "Well, Doc, we know that you and Mrs. Khan are family, but there may be some Looney Tunes out there that may not feel the same way, so we just wanted to make sure you'd be okay." That was 22 years in the making. And it shows the importance then of developing relationships and how it's not just about sitting there and saying, "Well, I'm a Muslim, you're a Christian, don't shoot." Kind of what was at the beginning of the 9/11 era, the kind of dialogue that was happening. And we saw the need to have what I like to call the post-Kumbaya era. It's wonderful to get to know people, but there really then needs to be this movement beyond. And I've been so blessed in having the opportunity. I mean, perhaps John and I can talk about how the class really came about in a serendipitous way, very much the same way that my relationship with Kurt came about. And by the way, I'm like absolutely thrilled that finally these two are coming together. And being a bridge for that it gives me a warm fuzzy. But I also realize that for some people, building bridges, like what Janey said, is a challenge because of how communities, oftentimes our own, will cannibalize one another and say, "Why are you doing this? Why would you possibly want to do it?" And realizing that that's okay, that sometimes you don't have to build a bridge, you can build a tunnel. There's nothing wrong with working in the tunnels when it comes to engagement, as long as there's some engagement going on. What I learned from all these opportunities of engagement, though, are that you have to have two critical components going in. You have to create the safe space, and you have to build trust. If those things don't exist, the backslide potential is always so great. And what I found both in the experiences working with Kurt through IGC, the Idea Fund with Issachar, with John through Rochester College, and a relationship that now even transcends that while he's at Pepperdine, is this idea of striving to move beyond transactional relationships toward, ideally, these transformative and transcendental relationships. If it's not organic, there's always the danger of the mistrust coming back. So that, I suppose, then is the opportunity that needs to be seized at all times. Thank you.
Thanks. I'm going to actually ask John and Saeed to talk a little bit about how their class came together. I want to touch on one point briefly that came up both in Muhammad and Janey's, and actually has been present in a number of conversations. Sometimes there is a caution of, do I represent my faith well enough? Do I understand it? Can I articulate it? And while there is a place for that kind of robust theological engagement, and at some point it is very important, I think that's a wrong barrier. One of the things that jumped out at me, even when we had our first gathering on creation care in Istanbul, we went around in circles. We did a lot of small group work by design where we interact. That's where you actually get a chance to build relationships. But the very first question of that whole event was, when you hear the word creation, what do you think it means? And so being the good leader I should be, I said I would answer that first in our group. And I said, well, I grew up in West Michigan. So creation, well, you don't really think that much about creation. It's just the introduction to get to the real story, fall and redemption. And next to me was a Catholic priest from Georgetown, and he looked at me and he said, "Are you nuts?" I thought, oh. And it was just fascinating as we went through this circle how 3 different Christians articulated a different emphasis of what they thought about with creation, and 3 Muslims did the same thing. None of us would have been theologians that focused on creation or the doctrine of creation. We all talked out of our experience, some of us out of our ignorance, some of us out of a few more books we've read. But it was that kind of conversation that did such great spade work in helping till the soil that, hey, maybe we're not so different. Maybe we all have different weaknesses and strengths and understandings. Let's have a conversation, and then let's move from there. All right, John and Saeed, why don't you talk a little bit about how your class came together, and then I'd like to open it up for questions.
Okay, and jump in here, Saeed. How long has it been running now? 15 years?
The friendship or the class?
The class is a...
The class is about 6 years? No, this will be the 7th year because we started in 2011.
Okay, so 2011. So friendship of 15 years, class of 6 or 7 years or so.
17 years friendship.
Okay.
Yeah, he's going by the Islamic calendar, obviously.
This is like, yeah, that's right. That's why I don't teach math. And we had, and actually we represent a colleague of ours that's at Rochester College that isn't here as well, a third gentleman, and the class was co-taught, well, the three of us would teach it together.
We keep him back because he's the chatty one.
Yeah. But it really came out of a conviction. My colleague and we had met Saeed, and we had started just some of our initial collaborations with him when we took our world religions class to a local mosque. And we had our students experience Friday prayers, and we had a chance to speak with some people there. And Saeed was one of the people that we met originally, and it started a friendship, and we kind of clicked with one another, and he was a professor at Wayne State, and so next thing we know, we had him guest speaking in our class, and then that was leading to the development of a class. But really, it came out of a conviction on our part at Rochester College that what we wanted to do in this Christian education environment is not just have young people at a Christian college hear about Islam from Christian professors, but actually try to engage opportunities for hearing from Muslims, and with the conviction, the golden rule type conviction. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. I don't want outsiders to tell me about my faith and make assumptions about my faith based on I would rather them ask me and let me share. And if that's what I want, then turning the fair opportunities toward our Muslim colleagues as well, trying to open up the opportunity to say, well, let's let Muslims tell us about their faith and see what comes from that, and see what kind of friendships and dialogue come from that. And that's really what kind of began the class, and then Saeed became actually a co-teacher, and we started putting together curriculum around dialogue with one another, which had a lot of intellectual and academic content, but it was also just kind of sharing our friendships with one another in front of our students and allowing them to imagine that world.
Well, that's it. I think that perhaps what was most impactful for the students was to see three friends engaging with one another with a chemistry, with a shtick, if you will, and recognizing that there was nothing contrived about it, that these were three people who really got along and weren't just doing this for the class and certainly not for the paycheck, that it was real. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that, and I'll try to get the math right here, John, Keith, and I became friends for a decade before John then put forth the proposal for the class. And I think that's another important issue, which Janey and Mohammed both alluded to when it comes to the fear. I think a lot of people don't appreciate when people stick their necks out to do this kind of work. When I found out the kind of pushback that John was receiving from donors and others related to Rochester College, that this was too audacious, this was too soon, that this just can't happen. And to be with somebody who then will say and push back on those forces and say, you know what, it's going to happen, and to take that risk, how can you not then want to be a part of that? So that was very important. regarding the course itself, we had no idea what we were doing. At least I didn't. We had a very loose format for the course, but we also had incredibly open minds and open hearts regarding it. And for me, a lot of the students, of course, in the first cohort were sort of very still guarded, and they were asking me, well, why are you doing this? And I said, look, I'll tell you what my goal is. My goal is not to convert any of you to Islam. It's not for you to become Muslim. It's actually, my goal is for you to become better Christians. Because I find that if you are, then there really is nothing to worry about. And I would imagine that that goes the other way as well. Because it then becomes a lived experience more than it becomes a stated identity. Part of it, of course, as the buy-in is, I said, and John made this reference about having the opportunity to answer questions. I made it a point, and I had already done this when John and Keith would invite me to speak to the world religions classes. I would always give the same disclaimer. I said, there's no question that's out of bounds. I said, provided you're polite about it, I said, you don't need to put me in front of a firing squad. I'll answer any question. And if I can't answer the question, then I will get you the answer. I'll get you the link, I guess is how we say it now. Because I didn't want anyone to think of me suspiciously that I was evading an answer. If it is about building trust, and sometimes the answer was, I don't know, which I guess is an unpopular answer to sometimes give these days because everyone wants to be so sure. And the other is having the courage to admit some of the warts about the interpretation of your own faith tradition and its application. I think that there's, as Muhammad was saying, always this line to be drawn between being a proper ambassador and not besmirching the religion, and yet also being candid about some of the flaws as to how it is practiced or how the doctrine is refracted. So it became this wonderful learning experience. And you want me to tell them the story about Frank?
You can if you want. Can I add one thing? And one thing kind of pedagogically that we did, and Saeed's talking about questions, we really, when we shaped the class, we did it in a way that the students would bring the questions. So we'd have them do readings, whatever, and then they would bring the questions each class period. And we had certain standards for developing the questions well and asking them appropriately, but not backing off any questions. And then the three of us would field the questions in front of them as part of the class. And sometimes the questions would be, do you think Muslims and Christians worship the same God? That's a predictable one, but Keith and Saeed and I would wrestle with that together in front of the class. Sometimes it'd be about politics. I remember one question, the one that I remember was, all three of us have daughters, and I remember one student asked, if your daughters, Saeed, if your daughters grew up and wanted to marry a Christian, would that bother you? And Keith and John, if your daughters grew up and wanted to marry a Muslim, would that bother you? And suddenly we were like, wow, okay, so this is where the 10 years of friendship came in. But those kind of real questions and giving them permission to see us wrestle with that and even have different answers to it. Keith and I, the two Christians, we had different answers to that question. And Saeed had still a different one, but we were wrestling with that, not trying to come to some consensus, but just showing we are people in authentic, deep relationships with one another, wrestling with the way our faiths inform us and with the way they bring us together. And that's the question I remember. But do you want to tell them about Frank as well?
Yeah, I'm still trying to cultivate the ideal answer to the first question. The first group that we had, there was a non-traditional student named Frank. And I'm not even making this anonymous. His name was Frank. And one of the things that they had to do was provide reflection papers every week. And I noticed at one time, because I wasn't responsible for the grading, but John and Keith were generous enough to show me the papers, and they were really kind of skittish with one of these reflection papers. They said, look, we know you're a big boy and that you handle everything, but this one really kind of got to us. And I said, come on, show me. And
I did not want to show Saeed this paper.
And I'm reading it, and it says, as I see Professor Khan standing up there lecturing, I can't help but think I see the devil standing next to him. And I'm like, wow, mic drop from the reflection paper. And I had no idea who this guy was. It's a class of about 35. And then we had a lecture, we were talking about the supernatural. And after class, this gentleman comes up to me and says, "Hey, can I ask you a question?" I said, "Sure." He says, do Muslims believe in the supernatural?" I said, "You mean like how the Archangel Gabriel visited the Prophet Muhammad for the first revelation and for, 23 years later?" I said, "Nah." And so he then started to tell me his story, and by now we're in the parking lot. And he's telling me, he says, "Look, I led a very bad life. I did a lot of bad things. I'm not going to get into those things." And then I'm realizing, okay, I'm not a Catholic priest, and neither is he a Catholic, but this is kind of a confessional. And he then told me how he came to Christ, and I realized that he was witnessing to me. And he said, when I tell people this story, and part of it involved the supernatural, he said that the apparition of his deceased father and brother appeared before him saying, you're not doing right. And then the next day, Jesus appeared before him. He says, when I tell people the story, they think I'm crazy. And he says, what do you think about it as a Muslim? I said, well, for me, I think the problem isn't about Christianity or Islam, it's about frame of reference. I said, most people don't believe they've had a supernatural episode. I said, what did the episode provide for you? What changed in your life? He says, well, I used to have a really terrible relationship with my mom, and that immediately improved. I said, you know what, everyone has a mom. I said, maybe you could lead with that when you're telling your story to create a common frame of reference. And he says, wow, I didn't expect that you would say that. I said, okay. At the end of the term, we asked the students about their reflections about the term. And he came up to me and he said, the most important decision that I ever made in my life was accepting the Lord Jesus Christ as my Savior. He said, the second best decision I ever made was taking this class. And at that point, I realized that we were onto something. So.
Yeah. And Kurt, I don't know what our time frame is here, but can I add one small anecdote to this? That story, and Saeed told it modestly, but that story really says a lot about what those kind of interactions and engagements do. It also says a lot about Saeed and his willingness to come into the class and engage with students respectfully who are seeing demons flying around the room and Satan himself embodied in his presence at the beginning of the semester, and just kind of flowing with that and letting that kind of take place. The one anecdote I wanted to share that's similar is I remember Saeed and I were speaking at Pepperdine one time on this class and on our relationship and our interactions. And of course, we're saying all these nice platitudes about interfaith collaboration and dialogue and all this stuff and how we need to respect one another and all this. And it was all nice. I'm sure what we said was really good, especially what Saeed said. But afterwards, an older gentleman came down, and he had this look about him like his name was Dale. Like I'm trying to decide whether or not to say anything. And finally he came up to me, and he said, I got to tell you, I'm having a really hard time with what you guys are saying. And he said, and it happened that 2 months prior to our speaking that day, his son had been killed by a roadside bomb in Afghanistan. And he said, I'm a lifelong Christian. I'm doing everything I can to figure out what forgiveness means. I'm trying to picture my unnamed, I don't know the face or the names of the people that planted the bombs or who's responsible, but he said, I am having some deep struggles with resentment and hatred toward Muslims right now. And I'm having a hard time hearing you. And I appreciated his courage just to come up and say that and the way he said it. And so what I did, I said, can I introduce you to Saeed? And what I saw 15 minutes later is Saeed and Dale went up to the front corner and they sat down. I kept engaging with other people in the class and we were talking. And they had this long conversation over there where Saeed listened and empathized and lamented with him and talked and asked questions. And I saw this redemptive moment where two people, Dale didn't overcome all of his anxieties in the moment or his questions, but a human connection was made where something transcendent happened that at least sets a different imagination and context for dialogues moving forward. And trying to figure out how to create those kind of spaces, it seems to me, is what our class is about.
Thanks to you both. If anybody, we have about 15 minutes. I'd like to open it up for questions. If you have questions of any or all, whether about what you heard or something else.
There, okay. The comment, especially in response to John's comments, David Hookema, I'm here at Calvin College. I think one of the best ways that I have seen my own eyes opened and the eyes of my students opened was to get out of the United States and travel to both West Africa and East Africa. You mentioned your experience in Uganda. I've also done a lot of work with an interfaith group in northern Uganda that worked against the LRA during the period of LRA occupation and after. There is a great deal of animosity between Christianity and Islam in Africa, as we've seen tragically in places like Nigeria, northeast Nigeria. But there's also a kind of ordinary daily interaction that is just part of life. A friend, a mutual friend with Abraham here, who told me once at the Coffee Christaller Center, well, when it was time for me to go to seminary, my family is Muslim mostly, but I couldn't afford the seminary fees, so my Muslim uncle paid them. He, of course, would rather that I was an imam and not a pastor, but he said, you're Christian, so I'll pay your fees. I have a friend, a nun in Uganda, whose Muslim uncle was her sponsor when she took her final vows as a postulant, became a nun, because she's an orphan. And he said, you don't have parents? Of course. Normally, I wouldn't want to go in a Christian church, but you have a need. And I tell that story to Americans. They say, wow, that's incredible. And I tell the story to fellow Africans. Say, yeah, so? What's so unusual? That kind of daily interaction. And this is one of the many ways in which I think, I've given some talks about how today the missionaries are headed our way by looking at the religious communities of West and East Africa, which I know better than the rest of Africa. There's so much we can learn about how just ordinary interaction in daily life and family interconnectedness can overcome. The dialogue in the United States often feels so strained, and too often the dialogue does become a kind of let's minimize our differences and focus on what's in common and make sure that we make nice. And that happens too often here. And in the context of African societies, where these communities have lived alongside each other and cooperated for generations, there's a great deal we can learn.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And the only thing I would add to it is, one of the challenges in the States, especially when we talk about Muslim-Christian engagements and interactions, is there 1% of the population is Muslim, and many of them live in urban areas, and so talking about this is one thing, but trying to create these spaces we're talking about is a challenge here just because of numbers. But it can be done, but I resonate with what you're saying, and one of the things that I found very inspiring recently are these iftar dinners and some of the things that we've been doing trying to get Muslims and Christians together around food and around stories and around sharing families and meeting children and trying to start there rather than on the agendas that we're sometimes fed by the world around us. But anyway. Yeah, thank you.
My question is a little different. I'm from Nigeria. I'm from a town called Jos. And I grew up in predominantly Muslim areas because my grandmother was a midwife and got along very well in all of these Muslim villages. And that's 30, 40 years ago. In our city of Jos, things have actually changed. Even as we talk about the new face of the relationship between Christianity and Islam, I will tell you that a lot has changed. And my question is actually of both of you, because I feel that in the West, there is possibility, because of the laws, to be able to engage in this type of dialogue you are talking about. that in our parts of the world, at least in my part of the world, is no longer possible. I'll tell you just one quick story, and then I'll ask for your help. We have a friend, and he sells fabric in Nigeria. He's a Muslim. I mean, we got along very well with him, and he would bring fabric to my office, and we'll choose and then sew these things. And he even came, he's a Muslim, came to our son's wedding in the church because that was how close we had gotten. He would come and we would eat together. But you know, after one of the crises in Jos, I called him up to find out how he was doing. And he was going to come to my part of the town, which is predominantly Christian. He came, but I was afraid for his safety because of the people around and other Christians. I mean, I don't control everyone. I can only control myself. Now, I was concerned for his safety because I didn't know what others would do to him. Now, I also was concerned about my safety in going to where he lives because we're trying to build this friendship. And I think that in our part, we have regressed so much that what both of you are doing would not really be possible in my part. So my question to you is, what advice do you have for people like us and people like myself who would want to go and do some of the things you are doing to create that type of understanding for our people back in my part of Nigeria? I can't speak for all of Nigeria. I can only speak for Jos and what I really know. Thank you.
I appreciate that so much. I really do, and I know what you're saying, and I've experienced some of those things as well. I don't know if I have any great answer to it. What I would say, though, is probably what you would say as well. From the side of Christian witness, I don't know what to say except that our witness and our planting of seeds and our desire to be a leavening influence is not contained, controlled, or stamped out by politics or infrastructures around us. It may be made more dangerous, but while there may not be infrastructures in place that allow us to put together dialogue events like what we might have here in some places in the world, certainly there are opportunities to plant seeds of love and peace, and those seeds and those leavening, kind of from the bottom up leavening practices and powers have effect over time, our faith tells us. I don't know, that's not articulated very well. I don't know what to say to that specific situation except to say, boy, it's needed more than ever. The one thing that I would, in Uganda, it's not quite as, things have gotten worse in Uganda as well, not quite to the level that you're talking about. But one of the things that we do, a lot of our interfaith work in Uganda is not events where we sit around and talk about our friendships and get on panels and do things like this. It's more working with, and I continue to be active in this, working around shared resources like water or poverty issues or whatever it is in villages where, regardless of the politics, Muslim families and Christian families want their children to have food and water. And so how can we come together around those shared resources and services and try to build some bridges or tunnels of peace around some of those things and hope that the leavening effect works?
You know, I look at the situation in Nigeria, obviously not on the ground, but sort of from a more scholarly distance. During the colonial era in Nigeria, everyone was subjugated. In the decolonial or the post-colonial era, you have the commodification of people based on group. And so I think that this idea of economics is playing such a toxic role. And so people are coming onto the ground, and I'm not talking about actual missionary work that's being done by Muslims and Christians. I'm just talking about throwing money at these groups and the toxicity of that. I mean, I remember, John, you telling me about like how in Uganda before, the church and the mosque were basically two structures that looked identical. They were tin roof buildings. And then the Saudi money came in and built this big old mosque. And, you know, kids, you learn as kids that when you see a shiny object, you become jealous. There may not be any difference substantively about what's going on there, but everyone likes to have the new bright shiny car compared to the little rusted matchbox car. And I look at this as being one of the issues that's happening today and how we are allowing our religions to be commodified. The other thing that's happening is that there were differences in Nigeria before any of this happened, but they weren't exercised through a religious vocabulary. They were mostly tribal and they were ethnic. We have to contend with the fact that now the language of division is the language of religion. And so I think part of what we then need to do is have that reset. Not going back to, I mean, I don't think divisions are important as well, but to try to find what is the underlying conflict between groups. And to, as John said, bring them together with a commonality that affects everyone, like water, like healthcare, like education. Working with the same model that we have right now is unhelpful without addressing those core issues.
Hi, I work at a university in East Texas, so we're talking Bible Belt, Texas, and then East Texas. So our context is an intentionally Christian university. It's a little unique in that we have a lot of STEM programs and our international population's growing. We don't require a faith statement to be signed, so we have international students from various faiths. So we're seeing a little movement in this area, but the word interfaith is taboo, I would say, in our context. So it's all that you're saying, my heart is just like leaping forward, and I want to see, like, can see something like the Idea Fund happening in our context to a degree. Different conversations are happening, but I feel like one barrier that we've seen from our experience and some research we've done is bringing religious minorities into such a dominant culture of Christianity on our campus immediately diminishes their voice to some degree, or they don't want to talk about their faith because they are so outnumbered or have different fears. So that can lead into retention issues and a lot of other things. But I guess my question is, to move forward in this is something even like the Idea Fund. I feel like, should it happen in the context of a university? And I don't know a lot about Rochester and Union to know what those environments are like, but in the context of a university where the dominant culture is what it is, and we can't change that right now, and I can't control, you know, all the other voices that are around campus, to do something like that in that dominant culture, I feel like automatically implies certain things or possibly a certain agenda, whether it's there or not. Is it better to happen outside of the university and then bring it in, or is it a mix? So I guess for me, it's next steps. I picture certain steps and I just see barriers along the way. So from your experience, what would be the best progression?
I don't know if I can speak from a lot of experience, but I can use my approach, because context matters and differs, is I like to try little experiments and see what sticks. So maybe something in the university and something without. One of the things that I think typically still remains true of colleges and universities is you have a generation of people who are at a stage where they're willing to ask questions. Not everyone, but there tends to be a curiosity. And so if there's, whether activity or kind of engagement, and maybe it starts off and moves on, right, that can pique those that are interested, and then identify who your friends are. I mean, these things will take, it takes time to engage. I do think your concern is legitimate. If you're a small minority coming into a very dominant culture, having a few friends is important from within. I mean, one of the things I remember traveling through the Middle East at one point and talking, there are lots of Saudis and others from the Middle East who are educated in the West, but they always have a vision of putting them in groups because they want them to actually retain a set of networks and relationships. too, in understanding, because you can feel overwhelmed. So how do you create space for that? I don't know if I have the answers, but I think finding, whether it's a few faculty that share your vision, finding a few students, and then saying, okay, how do we start, and letting them weigh in too, and even those you're trying to build the bridges with, you know, if they're in the community, a few, where would they prefer to start?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think about my relationships with John and Kurt, and we don't sit around talking doctrine all day long. In fact, one of the big disputes that John and I have is what's our favorite Beatle album. And, you know, after 16 years, you know, you just realize, and this is why in Islam they say, you know, there's no compulsion in religion, there's also no compulsion in Beatles, that, you know, he's just never going to appreciate Revolver as much as I do, and I'm never going to appreciate the White Album as much as he does. But I say that in jest, but I also I think it hits home the power of culture. And the one thing that happens on a university campus is that, contrary to what I think a lot of students might think, there is a common culture. And I always like to say, you know, 90% of people out there know who Beyonce is, and the other 10% are lying. Culture is so pervasive, and I think now we have to also concede that religion is being refracted through the prism of culture, not the other way around. And so if we can find common ground in that, and not have to necessarily lead with religion per se, I find it's sometimes a healthier gateway and an icebreaker in that context.
One more question.
My name is Abraham. I come from, I work at the Akrofi Crystal Institute that David spoke about, but I actually come from Kenya originally. If I may just complete that story that John began about, John Azuma, Professor John Azuma, is that his uncle sponsored his theological education. And on that graduation day, he insisted at sitting at the front row of the graduating hall. And when the ceremony was finished, he went to all the dignitaries and shook their hands and proudly introduced himself as the Muslim cleric, uncle of John Azuma, who sponsored his education. Now, that's one story among many, many stories that I personally have come across, even in Kenya. I grew up in a town that was full of Somalis. Somalis are by default Muslims, and also Hindis, who run all the main businesses in the town. And you went to school together, you grew up together. I even had a Muslim girlfriend when I was in primary school. Uba Muhammad was her name. And we've grown up Muslims, we've related together, we've known our boundaries, we've known how to talk to one another without fighting. And that's the story of my lifetime in Kenya, as in many other African countries. And I'm actually amazed to hear that even here in the US, there are such beautiful stories. We didn't used to suffer Al-Shabaab attacks until very recently, in fact, only 7 years ago. Prior to that, we didn't used to have these terrorist attacks in Kenya. And the reason for becoming targets in Kenya now is since we joined the so-called global war on terror. We joined the big boys who go about fighting these terrorist organizations and situations. And now we've become a target. Ordinary Kenyans are now a target because we have been identified with those big boys who fight Islam. And I'm just wondering, I identify the mainstream media as a big negative force in the work, against the work that you're doing, as well as our relationships. And I'm just wondering whether there is, and this is my question to you, whether there is a way to counter that narrative that has been made so dominant in the mainstream media, you know, to promote such stories, to let ordinary folk hear these good relationships that are being fostered from the west to the east, so that people can change their perceptions. Because a lot of people today, whether we like it or not, actually their perception of things, the world, relations, are formed or are influenced by the media. So I don't know whether you have thought of a way in which to take those stories out there to be heard by ordinary people. Thank you.
I'll say something really quick, and then if you guys have something. I think that is so critical. The fact that we both communicate our faith by stories. Stories inspire, they give a vision, they shape imagination. That is something we have talked about. How can we be intentional? Not just the stories of what we've done, But there are lots of good stories out there. The problem is the media loves the negative. They love the stories that generate fear, horror. And so you get a little blurb in the newspaper. Oh, there was a conference of educators, and they talked about listening to learn, and it's going to get this much press, maybe in a local paper. And it's going to miss what is actually happening. That is something we're committed to finding ways to do. We're actually working with Ugandan priest on a set of stories that comes out of the Center for Reconciliation. I know storytelling is on the horizon of a lot of people, but I'm always open to listening how to do, find, collect, identify. But I think it needs an intentional, multifaceted strategy. You need to hear it in communities, in education, you need it in the media, you need it in print, you need it, I mean, there's just a lot of stories worth telling, and it needs to be something that you're in for the long haul, too. So I just think that's an important point I want to affirm that.
You know, I mean, I think about Kenya and I think about how the Mau Mau uprising was framed. And in England, you aren't going to find too many people who saw this as a positive. And those who were simply fighting for their liberty were branded as terrorists. And fortunately, Kenya was able to take control of its own narrative, but at quite a cost and after a lot of hard work. It also took someone of the stature of Jomo Kenyatta to go ahead and do that. And so one of the questions I think that we have to ask is, where are the Kenyattas, where are the Mandelas in the world? And I think instead of this idea that a lot of communities, I think, let me just be candid about this, that I think I know from doing a lot of this interfaith engagement that those that don't actually step up and do it are simply waiting for the Messiah. And either they're waiting for the Messiah from a Christian perspective, or they're waiting for the Mahdi from an Islamic perspective. And to quote from Beckett, I mean, it becomes like waiting for Godot. I'd rather be involved in, and I don't put myself in the same league as a Kenyatta or as a Mandela, but I think everyone can collectively become a Kenyatta. Everyone can collectively become a Mandela. And I think that if there's enough of a critical mass, that can then change the media narrative.
No, let John speak. Let John speak.
Go ahead. Thank you for letting us participate with this group. I would encourage you to, you are people of influence in the institutions you're at. You will have a chance to build bridges, and I would encourage you to explore, to listen and learn from one another as you go forward. It's been a real blessing to be here with you.